Way back, when I reviewed the Final Fantasy NES Trilogy, I noticed something particularly interesting about the second installment. Not the fact that it sucked for a multitude of reasons, but that it was a dark, story-driven game, sandwiched between two light-hearted games with simpler stories overall. What's interesting about this is that it actually forms a pattern when you line it up with the SNES trilogy. 1, 3, and 5, the odd-numbered games, are fun adventures which focus on giving you simple characters, if not straight-up blank slates, with relatively little in the way of character development or arcs. They offer fairly generic stories wherein a group of light warriors are tasked with saving the world, or worlds in 3 and 5's cases. However, the simplicity of these games isn't a problem, because their core appeal happens to be their job systems. By letting you mould your otherwise bland party into fun and interesting archetypes, these games offer a lot in the way of replay value, with 5 being a game that I still enjoy going back to. Want to power through the whole game with nothing but black mages? Or maybe with a whole bunch of thieves? Maybe you're the masochistic flagellant type and you want to beat the whole game with a sole white mage. Be my guest, you absolute weirdo. Point being, this fantasy world is your oyster, and it's yours to have fun with. On the other hand, you have 2, 4, and 6, the even-numbered games, and putting the questionable execution of 2 aside, these games are wildly different. They have darker stories in which characters go through hell and back, growing as people and cementing themselves in your memory. And their stories, when not just aping Star Wars, are full of twists and turns that keep you genuinely invested in what's happening. These games offer experiences that stick with you for years, but ironically, they aren't as easy to revisit, not for me at least. Final Fantasy 4 and 6 are undoubtedly amazing, with the latter being hailed as one of the best installments in the entire franchise. But there's not much I'd get out of sitting down and playing them again. To bring this lengthy preamble to a close, many later installments of Final Fantasy break away from this formula by combining darker stories with experimental battle systems, homogenized experiences that offer the best and the worst of both worlds. But the one place I did find a parallel to this whole thing was, funnily enough, in Final Fantasy X and its direct sequel. For those not following my LPs of these games, the former is incredibly linear and follows a cast of interesting characters. They journey through a world that proves to be dark, oppressive, and even genuinely upsetting at points, with death being one of the game's core themes. In 10-2, you're a bunch of gal pals flying around, hunting treasure, and getting into crazy shenanigans. The story doesn't matter, because you get to play with a fun job system that offers endless replay value, which is further encouraged by the inclusion of a new game plus. And in newer releases, you can straight up ignore the canon and create a dream team of monsters, or even characters that are straight up evil, or dead, or both. Who cares? You only live once, have fun. Whew, well, that was a hell of a tangent, wasn't it? How about we hone in on our chosen topic now? Final Fantasy IV, the first story-driven game in the series that doesn't fall flat on its face.
Okay, Dad, I just want to finish this game. Okay, Dad, I'm coming. Yeah, I'm almost at the end. What happened to Summer?
Final Fantasy.
If I had to describe 4 in a word, it would be focused. It has a story to tell, and it does so incredibly effectively, tying the gameplay into the story in a masterful fashion. From the very beginning of the game, you are thrust into the shoes of Cecil Harvey, a Dark Knight and the leader of an elite air force, the Red Wings. Through a scripted battle, which marks the first appearance of Final Fantasy's active time battle system, the game wastes no time in making one thing very clear. Cecil is a badass. For the most part, the beginning of this game can be effortlessly curb-stomped, so long as you rely on Cecil's darkness ability. It's great for clearing out enemies, at the cost of some of Cecil's HP, which actually serves as a metaphor for his personal crisis. After being pushed too far by the warmongering King Baron, to whom Cecil has pledged his loyalty, and after being tricked into committing a straight-up atrocity, Cecil realises that his power comes at a hefty cost. You see that? You see what they did there? So, after a mission goes horribly awry, Cecil finds himself saddled with a young summoner named Rydia, and suddenly at odds with his former king, and thus begins a journey of redemption for Cecil, in which he must travel to the other kingdoms in a bid to defend them from Baron's crystal-stealing conquest, eventually confronting his own dark side and reforming himself into a paladin. As Cecil journeys, he teams up with a number of interesting characters, all of whom serve unique roles to the narrative. You have his love interest, Rosa, Teller the Sage, Edward the Spoony Bard, but truth be told, there are 2 characters aside from Cecil that really stand out for me: Kain and Golbez. Kain Highwind is an interesting character. He fits a lot of villain tropes and is infamous for his repeated instances of betrayal. Hell, even his voice actor for the 3D re-releases voices him like your standard Final Fantasy villain.
Foul work to be sure, but we'll need to kill the girl as well.
Kain!
It's her or us, Cecil.
She's a child!
However, he's written to be a very conflicted character. He is Cecil's childhood friend, but has unrequited feelings for Rosa, which is certainly awkward. The inferiority complex born from this makes Kain incredibly susceptible to brainwashing from the real antagonist, which is why he flip-flops between heroic and villainous roles. And just like Cecil with his darkness, Kain's signature move also serves as a metaphor. By utilising his Dragoon Jump, Kain can make himself temporarily invulnerable, at the expense of his allies, who are now more likely to be attacked. Even his main form of attack is treacherous. Anyways, Golbez. Golbez is an underrated villain. Aside from looking way more intimidating than a 16-bit sprite has any right to, he's cruel, malicious, and ruthlessly manipulative, leaving you paranoid and hoping that he doesn't rear his ugly, horned head. His terrifying theme song certainly doesn't help matters. When you do finally confront Golbez, it's one of my favourite battles in the whole series, with him almost wiping the party before an aged-up Rydia swoops in to save the day. But Golby isn't alone though, because a la Garland from Final Fantasy I, he teams up with 4 brand new elemental fiends to achieve his twisted, genocidal goals. So where does this all lead? Well, admittedly, it gets a little dumb, but regardless, brace yourselves for endgame spoilers. It turns out that Cecil and Golbez are Lunarians, moon people, and Golbez wasn't acting entirely on his own free will, as he too was being manipulated by an angry moon man named Zemus, who wants to terraform, lunar form? Lunar form the Earth. After Zemus is killed, his rage and malice reform as the dreaded Zeromus. This thing! That sure is a final boss. Okay, the ending is kind of weak, but that doesn't detract too much from what is essentially a story of forgiveness. Cecil has to learn to forgive himself for his past sins, and forgive both Kain and Golbez for their transgressions. In later releases of Final Fantasy IV, your party characters can take on bonus dungeons, which offer personalised trials for them. On top of that, some releases of the game come bundled with an intermission story that leads directly into 4's sequel, The After Years. I have mixed feelings about The After Years, and to share said feelings in brief, it loses some of the focus. So that's Final Fantasy IV. Despite the ending, it still holds up today, and I would argue that it's one of the best entry points into the series. Have you never played a Final Fantasy before? I'd say this is pretty much the definitive experience. So yeah, I would highly recommend it. Moving on, let's take a look at Final Fantasy V.
桁違いの凄さだぜ。ファイナルファンタジー5スーパーファミコンで好評発売中。
Final Fantasy V is an absolute joy. It follows the adventures of 4 light warriors, Butts, or Barts, I guess, Lena, Faris, and Galuf. Their characters are pretty simple: hero, princess, tomboy pirate, and amnesiac old man, respectively. As light warriors, they have to travel across the land to collect elemental crystals, but eventually find themselves in an alternate world where they pursue a villain who wants to return everything to the void. It's pretty much just the story of Final Fantasy III again, but with an angry tree instead of a sexy cloud. The plot isn't that important though, because 5's strength, as I said before, comes from its wonderful job system. Your characters start as freelancers, generic units who can attack, use items, and that's pretty much it. But as you travel and find crystals, you earn jobs, which can be used to modify and improve your freelancers however you want to. Most of the jobs from Final Fantasy III are present, but there are a lot of new ones. Blue Mages! Mages who can learn attacks from enemies, including moves that insta-kill enemies whose levels are divisible by 5, and moves that can alter your enemy's level if they're divisible by 2. This class is fun for people who like to kill things with maths. Time Mages! Mages who can manipulate time and space, speeding up allies and halting enemies. Also, meteors. Mystic Knights! Hybrids who combined black magic spells to weapons. Very helpful when combined with Drain. Berserkers! Beastmasters! Who can directly control and even capture enemies. Dancers! They dance. And they suck. Samurai! Powerful katana-wielding fighters who can insta-kill weaker enemies or spend money to dish out huge damage. Chemists! Amazing self-buffers who can revive allies for free and whose medicines make them hard to kill. Mimes! The best class, almost rivaling a fully boosted freelancer. Mimes can be used to copy abilities from every other class, and much like a freelancer, They can be fudged so hard, they end up attacking 8 times with 2 swords boosted by Ultima Magic in just one move. They are busted, in a very good way. And all of that is not even covering the 4 new jobs introduced in re-releases. Necromancers, undead mages who can learn dark magic from enemies. Cannoneers, blow shit up. Gladiators, almighty warriors who can wield almost anything and crush enemies with finishing moves. And oracles, mages who blow everything away with disasters and cataclysms. So depending on whether you're playing the original game or a re-release, that is either 22 or 26 jobs, all of which can be combined or customized however you want. The potential for replay value here is almost endless, which is why the Final Fantasy V Fiesta is a thing. Every June, a cool guy named Eric Koziol hosts a charity event in which people are encouraged to play through Final Fantasy V using randomly chosen jobs. And yes, I will be participating this year. Anyways, getting back on track, Final Fantasy V is one of my favourite games. It's simple, it's engaging, and it can even be funny at points. The game doesn't take itself that seriously, which allows for fun and hammy characters like Gilgamesh to take the spotlight. However, the game isn't completely devoid of dark elements, especially near the end. The main villain, Xdeath, is no joke. Sure, he's an evil tree and he's hammy as all get out, but he does straight up murder Galuf, calling for a new character to take his place. And at the end of the game, after you've tested your mettle against the first ever super bosses, Omega and Shinryu, you finally encounter Xdeath in his true form for a surprisingly tough final battle. If any of your characters are down when you finally destroy Xdeath, they actually die, giving you a bittersweet ending. It's quite shocking and serves as a nice contrast, but feels aside, that's Final Fantasy V. Some of the best gameplay the series has to offer. So, how do you improve from that incredibly high bar? How about we check out Final Fantasy VI and find out?
Okay, kid, show me what you got. Yeah, right. Next! Yes! Next! Ooh, scary. Next! 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 Next!
Final Fantasy III. Do you have what it takes?
Next!
Final Fantasy VI is often regarded as a masterpiece, and with good reason. Visuals? Gorgeous, with beautiful sprite work used to complement the game's steampunk aesthetic. The music? It's the best in the entire series. And the story is enthralling. Speaking of which, you start the game hypnotized and raiding a small defenseless town using a mech, which is fueled by ancient magic and modern technology. Where Cecil's intros serve to demonstrate how capable Cecil was in a fight, these curb stomps are a crash course into the terrifying power of magic technology, or Magitech for short. After some wanton destruction, Terra, one of the game's central protagonists, escapes from the grasp of the evil empire that was controlling her, and finds herself joining a resistance group. You see, the Empire wants to acquire espers and harvest them for their magic, so they can take over the world. And I know what you're thinking, this is just Star Wars again, right? We've seen this all before. Well, this game takes a turn. The Emperor's main lapdog in this game, the Darth Vader, if you will, is a wacky clown character named Kefka, a straight-up comical villain who is so over the top, such a large ham, it is impossible to take him seriously. That is until he horribly kills a bunch of innocents by poisoning them. Then he becomes a little less funny. And at a pivotal moment where you finally confront the Emperor, in what you'd expect to be the final encounter, Kefka backstabs the guy. He takes ultimate power, and he destroys the world. Kefka wins, becoming an all-powerful god of death. So, not quite Darth Vader anymore, eh? Instead, you have an emotionally unstable man who is prone to tantrums and kills his leader to seize power when push comes to shove. After which, he decides to destroy everything in an act of violent nihilism. Final Fantasy VI did it first. So, the second half of this game is post-apocalyptic, and the tone is beautifully miserable. And this is where the game's ensemble cast of characters really shine. 6 has no clear central protagonist. Remember how I said that Final Fantasy IV had 3 characters that really resonated with me? Well, in this game there are 15 party members total, and almost all of them are deep, complex, and lovable. Terra herself is revealed to be half Esper, and has to cope with the fact that her people were victims of the Empire's genocide. Celis, a defected Magitech knight, ends up with nobody left but her uncle after the apocalypse, and if said uncle dies under your care, Celis tries to commit suicide in what is probably one of the most harrowing scenes I've ever seen in a video game. You have Locke the Adventurer, who is guilt-stricken by his past, blaming himself for his girlfriend's death and seeking to bring her back, and Mog the Moogle. Even this cute Moogle loses his whole family and is left alone to live in a cave, thanks to Kefka. The second half of Final Fantasy VI is essentially a self-imposed quest to travel across the world and recover all the party members who you, as the player, have grown attached to. You don't have to retrieve all of them, but the more characters you have in tow, the easier it is for you to brave the horrible wasteland Kefka leaves for you. Especially with all of the bosses and super bosses thriving in it. And at the end of the game, you finally face off against Kefka, in a battle that is so grandiose and climactic, analyses have been written about it. I'd play a small sample of the final boss theme like I usually do, but, well, it's 17 minutes long with 4 movements. Dancing Mad is an orchestral masterpiece which, to grossly simplify it, takes you through Kefka's twisted stream of consciousness, or at least that's how I interpret it. It starts off sounding like religious music, what with the church organs and the choir, which slowly builds and becomes more dramatic, until you finally see the angelic clown himself, and the more intense music kicks in. Kefka's mockery of religion, his masquerade if you will, falls apart, and by the time the fight ends, Kefka has lost everything. His power, his motivation, his sick desires. In his last moments, he almost becomes a tragic figure, He is devoid of all humanity, and he welcomes his own destruction. He is the best Final Fantasy villain, hands down. And guess what? Even after all is said and done, Kefka still left his mark. The world remains a husk of its former self. The death and destruction? They aren't just undone. This cast of characters that you fell in love with, all they really have left now are a few surviving family members and one another. It leads to a very bittersweet ending, and weirdly enough, I'm quite fond of it. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this video. Next up, we're gonna break the pattern that I was so proud of noticing, and we're turning our gaze towards the PlayStation Trilogy. Moving on to serious business, if you could support me on Patreon, I would forever appreciate it. The chump change that YouTube was slowly trickling out to me is getting cut off soon, so your donations will be keeping me and this channel afloat. With that, thanks again for watching, and see you soon.